from the first book, even close friends of mine. I mean, it gave her a fiance in the first book without, it's not a spoiler of any kind, but he's killed before the wedding, and she hasn't gotten over that as the series starts. And he was somebody she met in Virginia while she was at school. And two of my best friends came to my first book signing, two of my best friends from law school, and said, I never knew about this. Fiction, get real. I gave her because I wanted her to have a house in the country to show how she escapes from this very grim world that she's in. And so I gave her a trust fund. And you know, I didn't have a trust fund, and my father didn't create this medical device that made a lot of money, but people would sidle up and go, oh, the trust fund. Didn't know your father well, never knew there was a trust fund. So it's you know, and of course she's 5'10" and she's a size 4 or something. I mean, one of the nastiest pieces of mail I ever got when people wrote mail. Now it's just so quick, get nasty pieces anyway. But this woman wrote and said, it's horrible that she's so tall and so thin, and it's a terrible thing you've done for the sisterhood. That, you know, and I said, man, I have done so much for the sisterhood. My fantasy is to be 5'10" and weigh 118 pounds. I mean, there it is. So people attach to every part of the personal bit of it, and my biggest regret professionally is because Alex is so much younger than I, the one aspect I've never been able to show through the books is what it was like in the 60s and 70s and 80s to come to this work and to change, me personally, but for the people who were changing laws and what it was like to take women into the courtroom. So probably the next book, one of the next two books, I will bring in a sort of mentor character to her who had the job at that time, sort of to show some of that.
I was just thinking about the prequel. As you were saying, yeah, you just got to do that.
You got to do that, and it's like now when I lecture to DAs or forensic groups, the lawyers who are 40 and under just think there's always been DNA. They just, you know, like, oh, how hard could it have been? I mean, there was not always, yeah, there was DNA, but it was not ever used for forensic purposes till 1986. And the first case I was asked to use it in, it had never been admitted anywhere in the country. There were probably 5, 10 prosecutors looking at it at the time, was Robert Chambers. And it took 6 months to get a result from the FBI, which was the only lab. Now I can get it in 24 hours, but the FBI was then the only lab doing DNA analysis. And 6 months later, we had a hearing, and the judge said, it's so tentative, I'm not going to let a jury hear this. This stuff will never fly. And so there's so much of interest to me in that early work that I would love to show it somehow.
So you will. We've heard it here.
You've heard it first here.
So be waiting for it. I just was curious, but aside from the practical knowledge, you know, that your former career gave you, do you think practicing law and the schooling you had, how would you say that affected your writing?
I think in a very good way, and I'm not sure it's entirely the same now in law school. You know, it was before the days of the computer. We had to do a lot of legal research and legal writing. And when I got to the DA's office, writing briefs, writing a closing statement, the Robert Chambers closing argument that I gave was 4 hours. And, you know, it was like writing a story, except that you were bound by facts, and writing a story in a compelling enough way to be talking to 12 people to try to convince them that the evidence was with you. And of course, I worked as you know, Grisham published, as you know, a lawyer doing, and wow, that's what I want to do. Scott Turow, Richard North Patterson, and so I never lost the idea of doing it. But I stayed in the office long enough to see so much stuff become boilerplate, and so many young lawyers, you still find people who like to write and will write, but you can do half of the criminal practice by just plugging in date, time, place on a computer, and you no longer have to tell the story to the judge of how the crime occurred at an arraignment. You still do it at a trial. There's just much less emphasis in the law on writing. There's much less emphasis. I think reading is as important to a writer's skill set as writing. And so, same thing, we used to have to research. It's called shepherdizing the case. You look up one case, and then that would lead you to the 34 cases that were precedent for that, and you just stay up all night reading. And if it was an area that interested you, I mean, evidence and constitutional law, what the Constitution was, and criminal law, and not so much for me torts and contract, but these magnificent opinions. And now there's no such thing as shepherdizing. It's just you hit something on the computer and it spews out what the latest law in that field is, and you don't need to get there in the old-fashioned way. Some people obviously do. But so for me, I think the writing helped. Many people say, law school kills a fiction writer because it makes you be so technical and unflowery and unartful. But I think.
But I imagine the discipline of that work. I mean, you do have to be very disciplined to be a writer. Nobody makes you do it. So
I think. Yes, I think that's a word that's probably one of the most important things that anybody needs to hear, and that nobody makes you do it. I have a very good friend who was a Wall Street Journal reporter for a long time. She's smart, and she said to me 8 books in, like, does your editor give you ideas about what to write? No, that hasn't happened yet. And that discipline of going in the room every day, to, especially when you start, to a blank screen, and a good day, and I'm a collegial person, that's one of the things I love most about the other job. A good day is when, I said, nobody calls, and nobody, your friends say, look, I am writing now, I need to be in the zone. Do not call to gossip about who's doing what with whom at the DA's office, or what's happening. And the word discipline is such a critical part of this work.
I think so. I was just thinking of something which I didn't write down here, and I don't even know why this happened, but I was thinking, because you're talking about your former work, and I'm thinking in my head the two things you've done, and I always had this quote on my wall in my studio office, and it's from Alfred Hitchcock, and he and Ingrid Bergman had made many successful movies, and then they made a flop called Under Capricorn, and she was like suicidal and crying, and he said, Ingrid, it's only a movie. And I had that on my wall, it's only a movie, but your former work was not only a movie. So now you come from this, where consequence is huge, what you're doing, into this. So was it a relief?
That's a really good question. I've never been asked that. I mean, it was a relief because I wrote my first 5 novels, in addition to novel, while I was still prosecuted, by choice. I mean, my first advance was not a big advance, but it was better than a city government salary. And I chose to stay because I loved the work that I was doing. And I stayed, and so I'd write early, very early in the morning, usually for 2 hours, from 5:30 to 7:30 before I went to the office, and I'd work weekends. And as Jonathan and I were saying, I've never written at night. Give me that glass of wine or scotch. Jonathan is a night writer and prefers that.
I'm drunk too.
Okay. I should try that one. Can I do that? But it's a little overdramatic to say, in terms of both victims and offenders, that you were holding people's lives in your hand, but you were. I mean, you couldn't take anything lightly. And when I had pressing book deadlines, and as I do now, as I'm behind this week, did not know that was a Hitchcock line. I just say to myself, it's only a book. And that calms me down. I mean, it's not meant to belittle it, but it's just like, it's just a book, it's got a deadline, and nobody's life hangs in the balance.
Right, we'll discuss that with publishers and editors in the audience. The other thing, the other line, which is we said before, but my graduate school teacher used to say, "Stop whining. Nobody made you do this." So I think, but it doesn't stop us.
No, at least you whine to each other. I mean, exactly.
I mean, people would be. In fact, you really can't whine about it. But since many people out here are writers, and you'll be talking to more of them afterward, even, do I say more intimately, Will? Perhaps. I'm curious about the process of your writing. Do you outline? Do you write the ending first? What is your writing process?
Okay. usually for me, the seed germinates for quite a period of time, and again, fortunate because I've chosen to do a series. So it's almost like wherever I am or whatever I'm doing, it's a what would Alex do in this situation, or it's a my two male detectives, but the guy with the mouth and hopefully the sense of humor. It's like I can put him in a room and just think of, write a line of dialogue and slip it in my pocket for 3 books down the road. My self-branding, the thing that I sort of decided to do that nobody forced upon me, that I like doing, the books have a New York-centric, there's some aspect of New York City history that I like to explore. I don't like car chase books, I don't like shootout books, so it was my way of keeping interest in what I was writing, so I would take something, often a place in New York, or industry in New York, and look at it a little bit historically and set my crimes in there. So I have notebooks full of different worlds that I want to go into. So usually I've got these worlds, and the first thing that happens is somebody's going to die in that world. And once I figure out who, then I don't write an ending, but then my interest is how does it end? Who did it? Ed McBain used to say, the cops get there. I don't have to know when I start a book. Ed would say, I don't have to because when the police get to the body, they don't know what they're going to find out. They don't know where they're going. So I can twist and turn that way. For me, two things in particular. Crime fiction readers are pretty smart. They like the puzzle. They like guessing. Most of us don't mind being wrong if the red herrings are intelligent. But there have to be clues along the way. There is nothing worse than reading, for me, a crime novel that finishes on page 425, and on page 413, the killer comes out from behind the curtain, and you meet him for the first time, here he is, and nobody could have possibly noodled out how it got to that point. And secondly, my character doesn't like guns, and so it's not, she's not going to solve her situation by pulling out a gun and killing somebody who's put her in jeopardy. So I always sort of think out, am I going to end this in a place, in this kind of overarching setting, where she'll be able to, I don't need to know exactly what it is, but can Alex Cooper get herself out of this without having a magnum?
So you do have there is an intuitive part of your writing process,
right. Yes, that. And then I start telling the story, and usually I've never, ever, and everybody who's been here tells you something different, and every friend I have does it a different way. I've never done a very, very tight outline. I outline sort of 5 chapters at a time. I see where those are going, because things take on a life of their own. They twist and turn, and 5 become 8, because you think, okay, this is a good place for this clue, so that adds a chapter 6 that I really hadn't thought the characters were going to go there, or you create a suspect and he may be a little more interesting, or a defense attorney more interesting. I got so much criticism from my friends in the courthouse 4 books in saying, oh, your prosecutors are all so smart and funny and charming and cute and all of that, and every defense attorney you create is just a sleaze. And so then I created this defense attorney who I adore, and I just, he's mostly out of whole cloth. He doesn't really exist, but I realized that he's, yes, we were entitled to see a really smart, well-spoken, charming, do the right thing for his guy defense attorney. So that becomes almost a chapter when I introduced him that I wasn't planning to do. So I sort of do 5 or 6, take a breath, kind of where the next 5 or 6 going, where the next 5 or 6 going, and it's what I would call a loose outline, and tracking all the time. I've got little charts of like what are my clues, what do I need to tie up at the end, and I've sort of got the list of clues that I've laid in that you may go, I'm hoping you go back to and say, okay, she did give us that. It's not so out of the blue, it's not so crazy.
No, you mentioned New York. That was a further question, but I figure since you did that, I'll be as loose as your outline. So some of it, you know what happens, I'm embarrassed to say, but I've read a lot of your books, so now I'm thinking, so what was the book with the cloisters? Was that the one with the bodies in the thing, right? It ruined the cloisters for me, though. I always thought the cloisters were so sweet and beautiful. And then after your book, I was sort of like, oh, this place is creepy.
It is very creepy.
But because you use, you know, a lot of New York landmarks and also restaurants.
Yes.
And New York ambiance and all that, I think which makes, for me as a New Yorker, I love it. But how do you find that in the larger world, that how people feel about all that New York stuff?
Well, it's also a question I've been asked in a very long time. When I started, my first publisher was Scribner, and I love them, and I'm at that now where I'm enormously happy. It was just a move, you know, it wasn't fighting people or whatever, but I was at one place a long time, and my beloved editor retired, and it was just time to move. So the Scribner people, when I started my book 3, were very concerned about this New York City history thing. And they said, well, great if you live in New York and you're at all at least been interested in history, but maybe you shouldn't tie yourself to it. The odd thing that happened, you know, by then and before was that you find that people in Australia, people in Oklahoma, people in Minnesota, some of whom have been to New York, some of whom grew up, and some will never be in New York, like it the same way that I liked Agatha Christie taking me to whatever part of the world she took me, and Ian Rankin introducing me to Scotland, and you know, Bob praises LA, and James Lee Burke. So that sense of place has had, I have, with bad mail I've gotten, I have never had the, like, why are you doing that New York thing? I'm sure there are people who don't care to read it, or it always it's saying Ed McBain's name twice. One, because I read him a lot, and two, he was one of the nicest guys in this business. But it made me crazy that he wrote about Isola and not the city of New York. And it was New York, it was totally identifiable, every place and thing in it, but he chose not to call it Brooklyn. And so I love being able to set things here and use real institutions, and they either resonate with people, or if you're from Iowa and you're never going to get here, you don't know, you don't care maybe if it's a real place or not. But it's working. The one I get the question about a lot is, why do you use real restaurants? I say, well, she has to eat somewhere, so why make up a restaurant? And all my favorite restaurants are in the book, and that gives me a free drink.
I think it's a brilliant thing to do. Going from the historic things you use in New York, and so we talk about research for a minute. Like, how much do you do, how much do you need, and all of that? Because I think those are two different things.
Sure. I love the research process, and not everybody does. There are writers who, of every kind, who pay people to do their research. I don't know how. One, because I like it, it's not anything I would do. I don't know how you ever get the nuance, certainly that I want to portray. So one of my books is called Bad Blood, and it's the building of the water tunnel number 3, that'll be finished in 27 years or something. And the hole to go down for the dig at the time was on 41st Street off 10th Avenue, and I actually got a permission to take the elevator down 600 feet into the bedrock of New York. I am not totally claustrophobic, but I don't like it a lot out there. And as I went down, I mean, it's bedrock, so I expected it to be totally dry. And as the thing descended, one of the men said to me, just look up, because the light is, if it was 10 o'clock in the morning, it was a beautiful sunny day, and you'll see the light. Well, and that'll keep you from feeling totally creeped out down here. You know, think of perspective. The further down we went, the light literally became a pinhole. I mean, not very comforting. There were light bulbs. But the most fascinating thing, 10th Avenue, between 10th and 9th, the Hudson River flows under the city, and the bedrock, this water was dripping from the wall 600 feet down. It was damp, it wasn't dry at all. Like, remember Journey to the Center of the Earth when I was a kid, that movie where we went down and it was dry and there were dinosaurs and whatever. I mean, I'm going down, and this thing was it just felt like the entire island of Manhattan was going to cave in on our heads in a minute. And it's, it's 2 pages in a book, the elevator riding, but I love doing it, and I love being able to write that. I stay very current. I'm still a lawyer, and I stay very current with the forensics. So that is necessary because I write procedurals. Harlan Coben, I hope all of you read him, and he's a good friend, and we share an editor. And Harlan's idea of research is calling me and saying, because I have 2 minutes, like, what do I need to do to get a search warrant in New York for my character? And I tell him that, and I get an acknowledgement always. I said, it's the easiest way to get the New York Times list. I'm in Harlan's acknowledgements. So there are all ways to do research, but some of them more shortcut than the other. For me, the hardest thing is stopping when I'm researching an interesting place, because it's not a travel guide, it's not a history book, and cutting room floor, you're just editing out so much of the stuff that you're never going to be able to use, but it's great to learn and know anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I'm going to ask only one more question because I want to talk about Linda's new book, and then I'll let you ask questions, but I'm in the middle of it, so I don't want you to tell me everything. But Night Watch, tell me if I'm wrong, is it the first book that's kind of ripped from the headlines that you've done? It is.
Yes.
Okay. So it's the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case,
Sort of.
Ramona,
Sort of.
and why now then, after 13 novels, do you decide to go with
Jay Wolf thing? Yeah. Okay. When Strauss-Kahn was president, yes.
The book will be for sale afterward, and I just want to point out, and I've said this before, books may be extinct very soon. So get this as a memento so that when you show your children, you say, "Not only is this a book, but Linda Fairstein signed it with a pen.
With a pen.
Okay, please. Now.
Okay, thanks for that brass commercial.
Yeah. Was it really that great?
No,
Okay.
I think you can do it.
Yeah, right.
So I resisted. I've used motives from real crimes in creating my own characters. I've taken, actually I found more interesting characters in obituaries. One of my favorite things to read, like really long obituaries of people with very interesting lives, and you just find, the guy who invented the zipper or, something that you can draw from. But when Strauss-Kahn happened, and I was in the process of picking my world, I was using the restaurant business because I had a long relationship before I married my husband with a guy who was in the restaurant business in France. So it was it's a really dirty business, as elegant as the exterior is. So I knew sort of that was going to be part of it. And here we have this Frenchman who does this terrible thing of one sort or another in the hotel room. And had I been still in the Manhattan DA's office, it would have been my case. And Cy Vance, who I hope you all voted for, and will vote for again this year, is a great friend of mine, the Manhattan DA. And I literally called him that Sunday when it was in the paper, and I said, if you want me to work on this, I'll come back, I'll do whatever you want, pro bono, I'll do it. And he said, we're fine, thank you. We have 500 lawyers here, we're doing just fine. And everywhere that I went, as much as I tried to put it out of my head, everywhere I went, breakfast, cocktail parties, family dinners, strangers, bar mitzvahs, somebody would say, what's with DSK? What do you think happened? How would you handle it? What would you do differently? And the more I pushed it away, the more I wanted to get inside the case. And so when I finally made the decision to do it, I wanted to change the dynamic of race in the cases. I wanted to change the power dynamic, and I really wanted to explore, which I had not done in these books, what do you do as a prosecutor when your own witness, who the police responded to, they take this prominent man off the plane without knowing a thing about the woman who's made the complaint, they're all out to help her, she's believed by the police, by the hospital, by the prosecutor, who puts her in the grand jury, by everybody, and then she starts unraveling. She starts refusing to cooperate. Everybody's fighting for her, and she's got this living on the margins kind of life where is she not being truthful for reasons we can understand, or is she deceitful? And so I really wanted to explore that part of what goes on in the prosecutorial world, because almost all the other cases were easier in the sense that Alex is always fighting for someone who she knows was victimized and it was clean. Do we have the right guy or not? But the relationship with the victim survivor was cleaner. So I just couldn't resist going into that world and creating. You haven't gotten to my own twists.
Well, it's interesting reading the book, and it goes back to something you said before. I completely believe it. A, because of the book you're presenting to me, and then also because I know your history, so I think every word is true that I'm reading. So, but even I do that. Everyone seems to do it. So we have a few minutes for questions, then book sales, and then Linda will tell even more. This is nothing. The Crime Fiction Academy people upstairs. Quick questions? Yes, you have your hand up.
I'm looking at the first-person voice.
Uh-huh.
I'm told that it's really artist, but you just do it naturally or what?
Well, I explored, I actually bought a book called How to Write a Novel. I think the woman's name is Dorothy Bryant, and Susan Isaacs had been on television when I first idolized, before I knew Susan Isaacs, who's lovely.
She was here last month.
She's great. And she wrote, her first success was Compromising Positions, about a dentist molesting patients, and I had that case in 1977, my first high-profile case. I thought, wow, you can make a career out of this. And she was on the Today Show, when novelists could be on the Today Show, and she said, and I started with this book, How to Write a Novel. And truly, I had never thought of, I was just forming the plan to do it. I was writing my nonfiction book, and was at the tattered cover in Denver with my nonfiction book when I saw How to Write a Novel, the one Susan had talked about. And among the things it said, like chapter 1 was, pick a voice. Are you going to be speaking in the first person? And I'd never even stopped long enough. I mean, it wasn't that far along in the fiction process to think what to do. And to me, it seemed the simplest when I read the others to do. All I had to know was what's in my head, saying I'm a character and I'm not, but I just have to think like Alex Cooper. And that was the thing I was confident professionally that I could do. And I've watched many of my peers go back and forth very nimbly and do, start in the first person, move to other books in the third, do some with both back and forth, which I have enormous respect for. And I am very much afraid to try, I probably will at some point, but I'm sort of afraid to try anything other than the first person. I think feeling that I knew it was really a write what you know, and that's what I was doing in the book, that it was the most comfortable thing to do. And now it's this series, and yes, I could change, but
The whole areas of your prequel will be in the third person.
I guess, so
Yeah,
I think still have to be.
So, no, I just was decided to make you nervous.
Right, thank you.
Yes.
You said you read a lot. Who do you love to read and why?
Okay. I read a ton in this genre because it's what I love. I would go back and say, when I'm writing in this genre as I am now, writing my own book, is when I read a lot of nonfiction. I just read The Patriarch, the David Nassau biography of Joseph Kennedy, which is a fascinating book about a very strange and complex man. And I like a lot of historical biography, and I read my English lit major in me. I'm determined to read all of Anthony Trollope before I die, so I kind of do a Trollope every now and then. In this genre, I just read Harlan's new, which is why he was on my mind. His book, his next one, 6 years, I think it's called, comes out in 3 weeks. I must say I had not read a Grisham in about 3 books, and I just read The Racketeer, and I think it's just a great story, a really, not like anything he's ever done. In fact, it's very Elmore Leonard-like, and I enjoyed that enormously. Rick Patterson, Rick Patterson, not James, is a great friend of mine, and I think he's a really fine storyteller, and I found him before I knew him, but as a lawyer who's made the transition, I think he writes a good book. I love Lisa Scottolini. I am new to Lisa Gardner because she's also at Dutton with me, and smart and young, and writes a really terrific thriller. Michael Connelly,
Do you find it's difficult? Sorry, do you find it's difficult to be reading other crime fiction writers when you're actually writing?
Yes, and I mean, basically because I'm still a fan, and I'm so afraid that I'm going to not plagiarize, but, oh my God, Bosch is doing this, and, you know,
What about Mickey Howell?
right, or to the point, yes.
I just wondered.
Yes, and that's, I just, you know, I have a whole bunch stacked up next to the bed, and in about 10 days when I...
Borrowing.
Well,
You're a
when
lending
10
library,
days
huh?
when I turn in this book, having done a whole lot of nonfiction just now, I will...
See, luckily they hadn't started leaning on Linda to get those pages in, because you probably, if it had happened, you know, she may not have been here tonight, but,
Never write at night, it's good. This is my
another
release.
question, excuse me. Really? Well, you know, this is for some of you, I know for a lot of, yeah.
How long does it take you to write a book? If you're really just doing it.
Right. I generally can write pretty quickly if I know where I'm going. And again, so much of my thinking and plotting goes on before I ever sit down. And that's hugely helpful because I'm telling the story in my head. And again, when I know where I'm going, it does not true in every book, it comes out better. For me, the slowest part of the book is the first 100 to 150 pages. It's like root canal every day. It's like sitting down and you're making up the clues, you're inserting the clues, you're trying to get a rhythm and a pacing and see, introduce the new characters, tell the backstory, which is a real annoyance to a lot of readers if they followed your series for 15 books. How much do you tell about Mercer's background, and how much, okay, your good readers are skimming pages, and your new readers, which you hope to have, want to know this, if they want to go back and read earlier books. So I would say I'm producing a book a year, so that pretty much means, again, cheating because there's serious characters, but I'm often researching 2 things at once, because whatever I'm researching now, something comes along that takes me, I say, whoa, next book. But the writing, probably 7 months, if the spirit, the muse is on my shoulder.
All right, I'm going to take the last. Oh, there are, sorry, please.
Sorry. Compared to some of the stuff you may have come across as a prosecutor, and then the stuff you come across as a writer, did you ever say to yourself, like, wow, this is really disturbing what I just came up with, or are you more disturbed by
That's a good
across as a
question.
prosecutor?
I'm more disturbed, like, real life stuff that always is stranger, often is stranger than fiction. So the cannibal cop, I'm actually doing some talking head stuff on it. Now, if I had ever created a plot line where a police officer in uniform is in the next room with his wife and baby in this room, and he's online surfing to find pictures of women who are hogtied and puts an apple in the mouth and says, I'm going to put my wife in an oven and slow cook, if I put that in a book, not a friend of mine would read it. It would not survive the editor saying, wait, tone it down. So that's often the case with real life. There are so many things that I saw and my colleagues saw, and my colleagues to this day, my good friends in the office, are constantly forwarding. I did the cleverest thing in court today in front of Judge Hayes, can you use this? And then he said the most outrageous, you're not going to believe this. So I think truth really is stranger than fiction, and I'm sort of always careful if I'm using something based on a real fact. There's just stuff that I know my readers, Stephen King's readers might be okay with them, or some Harper Wall guys might be okay with them, but my readers really don't want the cannibal cop to get to the point where he dissects his wife.
There was one more question, I think, back. Yeah, go on.
I've always been curious about first draft versus second and third. When you finish a manuscript, are you done except for the copy editing, or do you ever have to just go back and start it over again?
Oh, you were asking this at a very bad time. I'm sort of very compulsive. I self-edit as I go along, and so often it's a way for me to jumpstart myself. So if I'm on chapter 8, every now and then I'll stop and read the first 7 to make sure the rhythm is good and I'm in, and then you find things and change what is working. So now that I say this, I'm even handing in a book. I have never had this doesn't work for me, rewrite it, back to the drawing board, the second half doesn't work. But I think everybody has, before the copy edit, just something, sometimes it's, in Night Watch it was the editor wanted the last scenes expanded a little more, you know, build the tension, let's see without telling Jonathan them, but, you know, give me a little more, you end it too quickly and you've gotten this whole story to this point. Very fixable things. This courtroom scene is too long, and I think, well, I think it's necessary for them to see her, she's out in the field running around so much, I want them to see that she really is a prosecutor and can be in court. So my stuff has been mostly fixable, and I think by the time you're writing 5, 6, 7 books, it's I don't know anybody who's had to cut their legs off. But then you do an edit, and then you do a tedious number of copy edits, which are necessary in the business, but you get so sick of unless you're so sick of your own book by the time you read it 12 times in a month. It's, you know, even the parts say, this was pretty good, but well, what was I thinking?
Before we go over to buy books and have Linda sign, I just want to ask, so when are Alex and Mike going to sleep together?
This is the
I'm
number
waiting.
one question
So,
that I
also,
get.
really,
This is by mail, by email.
If you don't know Mike
bookstores.
Chapman, if you haven't read an Alex Cooper novel, I mean, come on.
So we get a little closer in Death Angel, which is the new book. We get a little
Always
action. We
working
get a
together
little
late
action.
at
She
night.
can't get into Evan when she's just, the French guy is just like, so, you know, you get mail from all kinds of people about everything, but the mail against Luke, the French boyfriend, was like an avalanche.
So there's a chance for Mike.
There's a chance
I've
for
kind of been rooting for him, you know, so Linda, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.